Okay, so I have got to talk about Dispatch. In case you haven't heard about this game, it's not technically a Telltale game because, well, that studio was shut down a number of years ago, of course, but the developer behind it, Ad Hoc Studios, was founded by and hired a variety of Telltale alumni, so it's very clearly a continuation of many of the same ethos of the Telltale brand. And I have to say that I feel like this game really solves the Telltale formula for me. Like, I've always been a passing fan of Telltale's output from back in the day, Back to the Future, Wolf Among Us, Batman, Tales from the Borderlands, all pretty fun experiences. But in my opinion, I think Dispatch does a few smart things that put it a step above the rest in this regard. So right off the bat, I just gotta say, I think the animation and writing is top notch. It's a great art style that looks timeless and does a really good job of making each character stand out and look awesome. And I loved all of the characters in the show. I mean, hell, my only real complaint about them is that I wish some of the characters got more of a spotlight, since I loved all of them, even the minor characters, so much. But what I think makes this game stand out so much over prior Telltale projects like this is the actual gameplay itself. You see, Telltale and Telltale-like games aren't exactly known for having a ton in the way of actual gameplay. They're usually more styled as essentially movies or TV shows where you make choices to affect the narrative, and if they have something like a fight scene or whatever, then instead of implementing a full-on combat system, they usually just play a cutscene with a variety of QuickTime events or something of the sort to slightly modify the outcome of the fight, or maybe the game will pause for a bit to have the player solve a puzzle before progressing with the story again in the main cutscenes. Either way, the gameplay systems in these sorts of games usually aren't very deep, and that's honestly fine for these kinds of narrative-focused games that Telltale made. It also makes sense from a technological standpoint, considering that it's just not really worth coding up an entire combat system for a game that might only be used for a couple of times and only run a very small portion of the game's runtime. And to be fair, Dispatch also has some of these elements as well. Like, there are a handful of QTE fight scenes, though you can thankfully turn the QTEs off if you don't want to bother with them. But Dispatch actually evolves on the Telltale formula by having an actual core gameplay system in addition to the main narrative sections, and I actually really enjoyed these gameplay-focused parts of the game way more than I thought I would. Basically, you act as, well, a dispatcher for a team of superheroes. Each hero has a variety of stats like combat, intelligence, mobility, etc., and the idea is that you receive a variety of calls from around the city, and you have to figure out what the stats are going to be relevant to each call, and send out the right heroes for that job. It seems really simple at first, but they actually do a pretty good job of evolving the gameplay systems over time. Each hero, of course, has unique powers that can grant special effects depending on what missions you send them out on. And, like, for example, Sonar has this sort of like Hulk situation going on, where by default he has high intelligence and charisma, but every time that he's sent out on a mission, he swaps to his Bat Monster form, and his mental stats swap with his physical stats, turning him into like this powerful fighter, but also like a dumb brute. Every hero has their own unique fun gimmicks like this that help mix up the core gameplay, and you of course get to level them up over time to improve their stats and unlock even more unique abilities for each of them. And they also mix up the core systems themselves as the time goes on. Certain events can result in heroes being injured and reduce their stats, or even down them completely and take them out for the rest of the shift. One or a mission might offer you an extra reward if you hit a certain stat threshold, or conversely, some missions actually penalize you if you bring too much of a certain stat. I think they do a really good job of making the Dispatch gameplay stay interesting throughout the entire game. I mean, hell, I'd probably play like an entire standalone, like, roguelike version of this gameplay system if they made it. I just think it's really fun on its own. But beyond the value in the gameplay simply being fun, I also think it serves a really valuable narrative purpose, which is why I think I like this game so much more than most other Telltale games of old. Like, for example, Telltale games are pretty infamous for having a lot of sort of false choices, or at the very least choices that just ultimately don't really make that much of a difference at the end of the day. Like, I recall the Telltale Walking Dead game, for example, was known for having a number of these moments where, like, you would choose between saving one person or another person, and you get this when you get this kind of choice, it feels like a really big deal in the moment, but because either character can be killed or otherwise written out of the story, then they don't want to have either character have too much of an impact on the story in case they aren't there. So as a result, regardless of whichever one you pick, neither character will really end up having that much of an impact on the narrative. And again, this is kind of a problem inherent to the medium. The only alternative would be to have a much more divergent branching story, which would be really cool, but is also a lot more expensive to produce. But this is where Dispatch's gameplay systems come into play, because now I'm going to try and avoid like spoiling things too hard, but like, for example, one of the choices that you make relatively early on is that you have to fire one of your heroes from the team. And to be frank, if we look at just the narrative effects alone, this has a pretty minor effect on the story. Neither character that you can fire ends up doing a whole lot that impacts the narrative, depending on like whichever one is still actually on your team. But because there is gameplay that uses these characters, you end up feeling that choice a lot more than you would without it. Like I said, each character has their own unique gimmicks that only work with them, and you can invest various level ups and upgrades into these various characters. So when you're forced to remove one of them from your team, the consequence of that choice, while not felt in the narrative, is felt through losing access to that character and all of their associated abilities in the gameplay portions. It's kind of a similar principle to like what games like Mass Effect did back in the day, where there were definitely a few choices that didn't really impact the story all that much, but they would impact the gameplay and in turn make those choices more impactful. Not to mention that there's a lot of banter that happens during these gameplay sections, and they do sometimes have these reflect your various choices in at least some minor ways. Like again, with the firing decision, for example, like your team will not only comment on the person that you fired and make banter about them, but whoever was on the team that was closest to that person will have extra dialogue and interactions being sad about the fact that you fired their friend, and they might actually even leave the shift early so that you don't have access to them at the end of the shift so that they can go out to go check up on them. There's like lots of little details during the gameplay sections like that that help reflect the narrative, and that really helps sell some of the choices that you make throughout the story. And I think it just adds to the story and makes those choices feel like they have a lot more consequence that no other Telltale game has really managed to make me feel before. Now, if I had to levy one other criticism about the game, though, I do kind of wish the street went both ways in this regard. Like I said, a lot of the story choices do get reflected in the dispatching gameplay, but as far as I can tell, not a lot of the gameplay is reflected back into the story. And to be fair, I think that this might be part of due to the limitations that they're working under. Like, from what I understand, this is actually effectively an FMV game, meaning that all of the cutscenes are actually being pre-rendered. So while they swap out what videos are playing on the fly, depending on your choices, they can't really change minor details within the scene in real time, because it's not actually being rendered in real time. But if it was, it would be cool if there were like some minor things that carried over from the dispatch sections. Like, for example, say one of your heroes got super injured or downed during a shift, then maybe during the next cutscene, they would actually show up with visible injuries on their character model. Or maybe, like, the next cutscene that happens after a shift could get modified depending on whether you failed or passed a certain mission during your shift. Like, if you piss off the Vanderstank Corporation that shows up throughout the game, maybe you then walk in on Blazer getting scolded by one of their reps in a meeting, or something, some minor things like that would have been fun to see, like, reflected from the gameplay portions. It could have been a fun idea. And like I said, I understand why they couldn't really do it with how this game was made, but hey, maybe that's an idea for Season 2 moving forwards, Moving back to the positives, though, there is one other big thing I need to talk about, and that's the somewhat unique release schedule for this game. So, Dispatch released episodically, splitting the game up into about 8 distinct, one-ish hour-long episodes, and this is far from the first time that a game has been released episodically. Like, hell, most of the Telltale games were released episodically, but the way that this like is usually done in the past was clearly done like mid-development. Like when the devs would make an episode, they would release it when it was finished, and then they would start working on the next one. Like the future episodes, like they probably were working on them in tandem to some degree, but the episodes that were yet to come out clearly weren't done yet. And as a result, each episode would be released months apart from each other at best. Like if you look at The Wolf Among Us, for example, the first episode was released in October of 2013, and the fifth and final episode was released nearly a full year later in July of 2014, meaning that there was a gap of around 2 to 3 months per episode. And of course, with that kind of release schedule, you always run the risk of getting into a Half-Life situation where each episode ends up getting delayed longer and longer and potentially into oblivion. But again, Dispatch handles things differently in this regard. Admittedly, the episodes are much shorter individually because, like I said, they're only about an hour or so long each, but all of the episodes were clearly finished long before the first one was released, and instead of separating the episodes' releases by months, they released 2 episodes at a time every single week over the course of a single month. And I actually really liked this a lot. Like, it created an environment not unlike how you would enjoy a good season of television. And there's a lot of fun, in my opinion at least, in being able to take the week to digest what's happening in the most recent episodes and discuss what happened, like, with your friends or around the water cooler at work and stuff like that. Like, hell, it even means that, like, you can watch streamers play through the episodes after you beat them so that you can get their reactions and see their choices, but you don't have to risk them playing, like, further ahead in the game than you, or someone in the comments spoiling what's going to happen in a future episode, because the episodes literally haven't been released yet. And I think it really helped contribute a lot to the game's hype that it's been building over the past month. Like, if the game just released all 8 episodes at once, day one, it definitely would have been well received, don't get me wrong. It doesn't change the quality of the episodes, but I do think that releasing it weekly and allowing people to have those conversations about the game in the meantime really helps spread the word and got way more people talking about it. Episodic games have already pretty much gone the way of the dodo at this point, but if someone else does want to do it again in the modern age, I think that the way Dispatch handled it is clearly the right way to do it. Because, like, making people wait entire months between individual episodes for just a couple hours of content is way too long, and definitely, like, you can still, like, talk about the episodes in the meantime, sure, but by the time the next episode comes out, the hype will have definitely died down considerably, and then you gotta kind of, like, build it back up again, whereas having that weekly release really helps maintain that hype and actually increase it over time, since more and more people can talk about it, and it's always in the public consciousness. And of course, if you prefer to just binge it all at once, well, all of the episodes are out now by the time this video will come out, so you're free to do so at your whims. But yeah, I ultimately really do like this game for what it is. The story is really good and engaging, all the characters are really well written and lovable, the gameplay really helps reinforce the narrative, and there's a good number of fun and interesting choices, both small and large, that you get to make throughout the story. Like, there were some choices that I had to, like, pause and think about for a while because I was worried about what the consequences might be, and then there were, like, other choices that I agonized over for an embarrassingly long time simply because I couldn't decide which option would be fun here. But yeah, as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. So feel free to let me know what your thoughts are on the game and any moments or choices that stood out to you. And I mean, hell, I know I want a Season 2 from these guys, and I'm curious what your people's thoughts are on what the game might be and where it might go from here. But for now, if you liked the video, make sure to leave me a like, hit that subscribe button, and ring the bell if you want to see more content like this in the future. And if you want to help the channel out more directly, there's a link to my Ko-Fi in the description. Thank you all for watching, and hope to see you all in the next one.